Morning, David. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'll start with the same question that I always ask guests. What's the hardest change that you've been through in your life?
Ooh, what, personally or professionally?
Either. Or both.
Man, gosh, that's well, yeah, that's an interesting start of a question that slightly blindsided me. I guess I grew up in Zambia as a kid, and my parents separated when I was 10, so I was sort of bundled onto a plane in the middle of the Zambian summer, but in January, which is obviously the UK winter. So arrived back as this sort of slightly bewildered kid with my mum and two sisters. Really had no idea what was going on. It was all exciting, I guess. And then over the next sort of in a year or two, it dawned on me that my mum and dad weren't getting back together, and that my rather miserable life in the south of England compared to my rather privileged life in as an expatriate in Zambia had come to an end. So that was a pretty big shake-up, I would say.
I say I didn't until I was obviously researching the episode. I didn't know that you obviously grew up in Zambia to the age of 10. What do you remember about that time?
Oh, it was a really fantastic childhood, Gareth. I mean, school in Zambia was it started at 7:30 and finished at 1:45. So my day consisted of getting up quite early, which you don't mind when you're sort of 6 or 7, being driven off to school by my dad. And he would then come back from his office, pick me and my sisters up. We would go back to our house. We'd have very kind of formal sort of lunch that was served by our sort of housekeeper. We would all sit in the same places around the table. It was always, a starter and a main sort of thing. And then both my parents would go back to work. And as my gran used to say, we were allowed to sort of run wild. Poor Rachel, who was our housekeeper, but was also effectively our nanny, had to sort of manage these 3 kids, in sort of beautiful, sort of sunny weather. And we would just sort of be out and put your shoes on. So yeah, it was a great lifestyle. We had a pool and a big garden, and yeah, it was a sort of time of sort of economic sort of growth and stability in Zambia. So it was a really fun place to live as a kid in the 70s.
So as you said, that must have been a bit of a culture shock, age 10, just suddenly moving back to the UK.
It was, and my dad stayed. My dad stayed until the 90s, actually. So every other sort of year, he would come and see us in the summer in the UK, and then in the even years, we would go back to Lusaka and have 6 weeks of time in Zambia, sort of safari parks, Victoria Falls, just time around our old house. So stayed connected with the place, and I've taken my wife there in the last sort of 10 years or so, and yeah, it's a wonderful country. It's a place I still feel a deep affection for and connection with.
I wonder if that that move of such a big move of country at a young age um, influenced you in terms of you've got a love of travel and not afraid to travel to well, you've been to many different countries, and I wonder if that's where that comes from, having experienced that at a young age, and then all of a sudden thrust. Had you visited the UK much when you were younger, when you were living in Zambia, or?
No, not a great deal. I think it did influence my interest in things global, and my passion for traveling. But yeah, in answer to your second question, we didn't come back much because the cost of flights was prohibitive. I always used to joke with friends that it's £500 to get to Lusaka. That's not quite true now, but for decades, I would say it was £500 in the 1960s. It was £500 in the 1970s. It was £500 in the 1980s, and £500 in the 1990s. So in real terms, the cost of getting backwards and forwards as a kid in the 60s and 70s was massive, even though my parents were relatively well off. So we only actually came back in the 10 years I lived there as a kid. But we did travel in the region a bit. So we were able to go. Rhodesia was closed. Zimbabwe as it's become, but Rhodesia was closed, and to sort of travellers from Zambia. But we got around to other countries, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. And I think it did light a sort of passion for me in terms of seeing more of the world as as I grew up through my formative years, definitely.
So going back to, well, talking of university, which is a subject, well, certainly accommodation, we'll probably talk a lot about later. But you read geography at what is now London Met. What was your university experience like?
Um, it was really good. I absolutely loved it. Funny enough, for somebody who ended up, in making a sort of professional career later in life out of PBSA, post-built student accommodation, I never lived in halls. But I sort of bombed on my A-levels, didn't do that well, and went through clearing, didn't get any university offers, and really late in the day decided I still wanted to do something, and my school hadn't really pushed the polytechnics at all. And actually, I was just reading The Guardian on the train one day, traveling somewhere, and I could saw all these small ads for courses that were available. So I sort of went on a so bearing in mind that A-level results, even back then in the early 80s, still came out on the third Thursday in August. Went on this mad scramble of ringing places up. Got a few interviews, Kingston. I remember one or two others, and then trekking up to North London Polytechnic of North London as was, and having an interview there, and being really impressed with the guy that met me and the sort of campus and the course. Getting an offer a few days later and thinking, right, that's it, and packing up my sort of home. I was living in Canterbury at the time, and heading off up to London. I had no chance of getting in halls. I mean, P&L didn't have many halls anyway. In fact, they ended up the Tufnell Park site that ended up in the IQ portfolio that you'll know, Gareth, was actually the site of one of only two halls that P&L had at that time, but couldn't get in there. So I ended up living in a massive shared house in Highbury, actually on the road now, that is super posh. It was sort of like a young one's house. It was sort of all bed sitters, really, sort of 15 or 16 bed sitters in this massive Georgian or Victorian house. Yeah, it was a really, really fun time, actually. And then I ended up living in various bits of North London in my second year, and then in Notting Hill in my third year, which I also loved. So yeah, I had a great 3 years at Poly, got my degree, and I look back on that time very fondly.
It's I then read that you went to work for the British Council, working. I really like this term, working on technical cooperation. It doesn't sound like that's what it actually meant, but what were you doing?
So after a brief sort of flirtation with market research, which I didn't really get on with, I washed up at the British Council at my mother's suggestion, and she said, well, you always loved Africa and you loved travel, and you're interested in all things Commonwealth, so why don't you work for the British Council? And I was like, who are the British Council? And I got a temporary, got a job there as a temp, and I ended up in TCTD, Technical Cooperation Training Department, which was a department of about 200 people, big department, that managed the UK government's programme for sponsoring students from the Commonwealth to study in the UK. These programmes still exist, but they're much diminished now compared to what they were back in the 80s. So back then, in terms of Britain's sort of soft power, it was seen as really important to promote scholars from the Commonwealth on vocational programs. So nobody was coming over to sort of read anthropology or anything like that. Students from all over the world, including places like Zambia, would come to the UK to do short courses or full undergraduate degrees or postgraduate programs, but it would be in things like shipping or forestry. And the desks where we worked were organised by courses. So over my 2 or 3 years, I sort of ran various different programs. But you would meet these bewildered students. Literally, would be brought up to British Council headquarters in Spring Gardens, just off Trafalgar Square. They'd be picked up by guides, they were called, who were usually sort of out of work actors who were very sort of had empathy and so forth. They'd be picked up at Heathrow, sort of bundled into Trafalgar Square. They would meet their program manager, of which I was one, and you'd give them loads of information about, right, you're going off to Newcastle University today. You're going to be there for 3 years. Here's your rail tickets. Here's a bunch of do's and don'ts. This is the professor that's going to meet you at the other end, and off they would go. And you would ensure their stipends got paid, effectively their student maintenance loans, etc. and you would manage that student, remotely for the period of their course. So it was a really interesting job actually. And it really sort of exposed me to, the power of sort of global higher education, really.
But you hadn't lost that want to travel. So off you went, age 25, through Asia, Australia.
I did. So, it's interesting really, because if I'd stayed at the British Council, I would have ended up probably working overseas. They still have offices all around the world, often sort of, closely aligned to the Foreign Office. Great sort of career track. I've still got friends who work for the British Council who are posted internationally. And even if I'd stayed in the UK, working in Trafalgar Square, the chances for lots of travel were there for me. But I was an impatient little 24-year-old, and I'd wanted to do lots of travelling. So much of the British Council's astonishment, because I was on a graduate track with them, I resigned after a couple of years and said, no, I've really got to get this sort of travel bug out of my system. So yes, off I went, saved up some money and put myself on a flight to India, and I spent several months, traveling around Southeast Asia and Australia.
And then you returned to Regent's College, Assistant Dean of
Yeah.
Students, and you said this was a live-in position. I'm quite interested to find out about having done a live-in, well, semi-live-in position at a couple of sites. I'm quite interested to know about what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, I got back and it was quite a tough employment market. I knew I wanted to do probably something that leveraged my experience at the British Council. So universities were an obvious step. So after temping for a few months, I ended up at Regent's College as the Assistant Dean of Students. People used to say, Dean Tymms. I used to say, no, I'm David Tymms. It was a living position. So I ran a place called Reed Hall. It had 208 bedrooms. You had students coming over from all over the US for a semester. So they were August to Christmas or Christmas to May, 15-week programs. I sort of managed everything really in terms of the non-academic side of that student experience. It was pretty tough, to be honest, because you're living in and you're always dealing with stuff in the middle of the night. A lot of drunkenness, drug taking. Federal drinking age in the US is 21. A lot of these kids were 19, 20, so they'd never been legally exposed to alcohol before. There was a bar at Regent's College. It was pretty full on. But I did that for 3 years. And the trouble with living roles is that they become sort of golden handcuffs. I was living in the middle of Regent's Park. I had been in a beautiful little flat. My meals were provided for free. I never paid a bill for anything. I was quite well paid. So, you sort of you get slightly detached from the reality of housing costs, to be honest. And my next two jobs actually were also living jobs. I went from there to Goldsmiths, and then from Goldsmiths to SOAS, and they were all living jobs. So in total, I did about 9 years of living in.
Wow!
And by the end of that time, I had my son, and I had a second one on the way, and it was really time to sort of cut the cord and in the house and stand on my own 2 feet.
Yeah, I remember when first hotel I ever worked in was down Oxford, well, round Oxford, and that was live in, and you pretty much your salary was spending money because you didn't need a car,
Correct.
you didn't your food was provided, and then you think actually when you went to move out, oh God, I've actually got to start paying rent again. Like this, I think you're absolutely right. And then you talk about a big change when we were preparing for this, moving to Preston, and that was a big leap for you to sort of move to Preston.
Preston was a big one for me. So I was at SOAS, School of Orient and African Studies, part of the University of London. Great little school, actually. Great little university. What I'd applied for as an undergraduate, unsuccessfully as it turned out. And they had opened a big new residence in King's Cross, Dinwiddie House, nearly 600 beds, and they had no accommodation of their own before, so I'd sort of had to mobilise that site from pre-opening, right through to sort of setting up systems to deal with the applicants and all the rest of it. And I did that for a couple of years, but it was still a sort of one building play, if you like. And so when I went to Preston, I saw an opportunity there. I needed to break out of this living sort of golden handcuffs that we've spoken about. Wasn't able to really afford to do that in London. As I said, I had my son, my daughter was on her way. So my wife and I I took this job in Preston as head of student accommodation, which was a much bigger role. I'd been running a very small team at first. I think 3 people worked for me. Suddenly I got this job up in Preston where I was running their entire estate, team of 25, 30 people, 10 or so halls of residence scattered around the Polytechnic as it was, or the University of Central Lancashire as it became. So yeah, it was a big career change for me. It's like going from being a sort of hall manager in PBSA to suddenly being, not even a regional manager, but a manager of of an entire division. It was a big step change, and I was only in my early 30s at the time. So it was probably the making of me professionally, I would say, that move.
You said you had an inspiring boss there.
I did, yeah. Eileen Murphy, we've lost touch now. She was absolutely brilliant. She was very, she was very structured. So we had weekly sort of one-to-ones, and she was very clear what she wanted me to do at a strategic level. But in terms of tactics and delivery, she let me get on with it. So, for example, she would say things like, and this is a real case, we need to get broadband into all of our residences. And this is the time when Ethernet, as it was called, but data connectivity was a new thing. They had tried it at UCLan in one hall. It had been quite successful. They delivered it in-house. The IT department had delivered it. It had been massively expensive. And just like, right, we need that everywhere, plus phones in every room. Go away and do it. So I loved working with a boss like that, which was just like, here are your objectives. Go and get on with them, and you'll be measured by the success of those. And there were quite a few projects like that. I really enjoyed working for her. She was very, very inspirational. I learned a lot in terms of management working for her.
And then, talking of big roles, you went down to LSE.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we're Southerners. That's my ex-wife now, but my partner at the time, was from the South London, born and bred, and she didn't really want to live in the North, bless her. And it'd always been a plan to sort of come back south when we could afford to do so. And the job at LSE came on probably slightly quicker than I'd liked. I'd only been at UCLan maybe 2.5 years. And yeah, it came up. I applied, and to my astonishment, I got it. But I remember Eileen Murphy, this boss I had at UCLan, saying, "You will absolutely hate it because it will be all the things that you've done here you will not be able to do at LSE because of the committee structure and the way that the Russell groups are run." And she said, "Obviously, I'm biased. I don't want to lose you, but you really need to think about this very carefully." But they were offering about 25% more salary. It was a big uplift, although you needed that to live in London. And off I toddled. And for about the first year, I thought, oh my God, Eileen was so right. It was so hard to do anything. I had my I reported to the secretary of the college. It was a very senior role. So effectively the head of administration there, one below the VC. And she was saying, don't try and pull up too many trees in your first year. And I was saying, I'm not doing anything to justify my salary, So we had this real disconnect. So it was hard to get stuff done at LSE. And the committee structure took me a long time to get my head around and to sort of embrace and to learn the politics of the place and how to get stuff done. And I never got very good at that, to be honest, because I was too impatient and too frustrated. I mean, I stayed 8 years, and it was a wonderful exposure to a really important institution. I mean, I ran a big department there. I had about 400 people working for me, and I ran catering and sports and conferencing and one or two other bits and pieces, all the commercial services. But LSE was a wonderful place in terms of just, who would be there. You'd sort of, run into, Tony Blair popping in to see Anthony Giddens or whatever. It was a really incredibly important place. But yes, it was frustrating to work at.
But that exposed you to private PBSA.
It did, actually. So one of the similarities between Eileen Murphy and Christine, my boss at LSE, was they were both quite big picture bosses. So one of the things that Christine Challis said to me was, when she used to smoke, she used to come into my office with a little ashtray, a little portable ashtray she would take out of her bag. She'd say, "David," she would like we have a sort of drawing of a model or something. "David, we need more beds. Get us more beds, but don't spend any money. We haven't got any money." So I sort of knew next to nothing about balance sheet treatment and off balance sheet accounting and so forth. But I kind of had to quickly sort of figure it out. And so this was in the year 2000. I went down to LSE. So they developed two big halls at High Holborn at Bankside that had, cost something like 60 million each or something. I'm probably making these numbers up, but it put a huge strain on the university's finances. They desperately needed more beds, and they wanted to do it in an off balance sheet way. So that was what brought me into contact with the likes of Unite and others. And I had a really fun time in my 8 years there. I developed three new schemes. We actually did them as FRI leases, full repairing and insuring leases. So LSE would sort of staple its covenant, if you like, to an agreement for lease on these buildings. One was in Trafalgar Square, Northumberland House. One was on Drury Lane, believe it or not, just around the corner, right part of Covent Garden. And one was out next to Nido in Spitalfields, although that wasn't there then. Lillian Knowles' house. So I ended up adding about 900,000 beds. I can't remember the exact figures to the college's estate, which was really good fun. And we did a couple of big refurbishment projects as well on the existing estate. So it was a very capital intensive period. So I learned a lot about, the finances of student housing and how the private sector operated. And it brought me into contact with a lot of PBSA operators that were private. And I think actually most universities were very suspicious of them at the time. They were new entrants. There wasn't much known about it. And the fact that me and my colleague in the Director of Estates, Richard Taylorson, who went on to work at various places and is now at JLL, the fact that we were sort of so open to discussions with anybody got us on the map, actually, and we were seen as a university that people could do business with.
And then along came IQ.
Along came IQ, yeah. So Rebecca Hopewell, who was one of the original founders of IQ within Quintain, was working for Quintain, and she had been at Sanctuary Housing Association, and she set up Sanctuary's student housing division. And we at LSE had a few flirtations with Sanctuary that had never come to anything, but we'd got to know one another. We'd got on quite well. I'd sort of said to her, at some point in my career, probably 5-6 years in, I'm nearing the end of my time here. I don't want to be one of those university lifers, and it definitely was a job for life if I'd wanted it. I'm interested and attracted to the private sector. Is there anybody I should be talking to? It'd be good to meet for lunch, get your advice. She obviously remembered that conversation, because a couple of years later, she tapped me up and she'd set up IQ within Quintain and said, come and have a chat. And that chat developed into my first role at IQ.
Remember, there were 4 buildings when you joined.
So it was pretty small. So, this is in the days, obviously, before the crash. So we were having these discussions in 2007. So it's just before the crash. So everything was pretty hot, to be honest. Real estate values were racing. The stock market was racing. .com, boom and bust was sort of a dim and distant past. Everything was rosy. It was New Labour's sort of, high time. And so they'd Quintain, this PLC, this FTSE 250 PLC, had decided they wanted to get into this student housing lark, and they had seeded it with 100 million of their own and 100 million of trusts money as a running mate, a 50-50 joint venture. And yes, when I joined, they had 4 assets that the JV had acquired. And 2 were run by CRM and 2 were run by Mainstay. And actually, my job was really, and they had, I think, 3 on site at that point, so they were really going for it, mostly with Watkin Jones, but with various sort of development partners. My job was to sort of help build the structure around this emerging business. It was always known that IQ would insource it. As part of my interview and my role, it was clear that they would want me to take a lead on that.
So I mean, it's easy to go through though. Think of the period that you were at IQ, and it was, I think, 14 years. Um, it's easy to sort of brush past that as, in terms of everything that you did there. But you said you pretty much ran every department whilst you were there.
Well, yeah, you can imagine that. I mean, well, I say you can imagine in 2008, when I joined. I mean, the first thing to say is, I sort of quit LSE in late 2007, and I didn't wash up because of my notice period. I didn't wash up at IQ until March 2008. And by then, the world was already, in a state of flux. And, Quintain was really beginning to sort of struggle. In fact, IQ was the only bit of the business that was really kind of, doing well in terms of valuation and sort of, financial stability and solvency and so forth. So it was a difficult time because the business was letting people go, but IQ was this sort of, golden child within it, if you like. But yes, when I joined, I think there were 6 of us, maybe 5 of us. It was a pretty small team. That became a sort of head office team, an established head office team of about 15 at the point we started insourcing the management, which actually we started with Preston, ironically enough. IQ Copper, you may remember. And yeah, I did sort of, over time, pretty much run everything. I mean, Rebecca Hopewell and Jane Crouch were very much operations focused. They both left in 2010 to join Watkin Jones, and suddenly I was thrust into this position of, Ian Scott will do all the investment and development, and David, you run everything else. So I mean, clearly, finance was operated by Quintain, but in terms of the day-to-day running of the business, I was over the top of everything: IT, HR, operations, health and safety, you name it.
You were even interim CEO at one point.
Indeed, I was. I mean, sort of to flesh out the other key story, which the listeners may or may not know, is that obviously it was, as I mentioned before, it was a 50-50 JV with the Wellcome Trust, and then in 2014, I think it was 14 or 15, Wellcome Trust bought out an Alien Quintain for their 50% share. So we were then wholly owned by Wellcome Trust, and not long after that situation or change of ownership, Ian Scott left to join Curlew, and I was the interim CEO pending Iliya Blasic's arrival. So that was a pretty scary 6 months to run the whole thing. Because I think in life you have to know your sort of limits, really, and certainly I was sort of happy enough being the number 2 and always having somebody upstairs who the buck would ultimately stop with. And you've got to, and at the end of the day, although I know a lot about property, I'm not an investment professional. I'm certainly not a qualified accountant. So running that business was a very stressful period, actually. I have to say. I think we were up to about 14 assets by then. We were getting quite big. The business was valued at north of 500 million. So that was a difficult time. And it was good when Iliya came in for me, because he'd been in effect a non-executive director of the business for a number of years, because he worked for Wellcome Trust. So he was the Wellcome Trust investment professional who had oversight for IQ. So he sort of essentially crossed the floor from a non-exec to a sort of executive role, or a shareholder role to an executive role. So we knew each other quite well. And indeed, he sort of actually tapped me up before he took the role and said, "Is this something, I'm thinking of throwing my hat in the ring. How would you feel about working with me?" Which is quite a decent thing to do, to be honest. And I said, "Bring it on, buddy, come on board." And so that was phase 2 of my time at IQ.
Yeah, and then I was there, and I still struggle to remember what year it was. But then obviously the merger came along with the Prodigy Living assets, and that was, well, from someone that was there in a support role, that was a huge change, even for me, and obviously working with the site teams, and saw that was a huge change. And I wonder what your viewpoint was of that merger and how that period was.
Yeah, that was a massive deal, because Iliya and I were in the process of sort of with Stephen Leon, who had joined as the CFO, the three of us were sort of in the process of building up this great business. We'd put together a business plan. We were thinking about, how we would manage the debt, equity, etc., what our next targets would be. And it was a really fun time. The three of us. There was a lot to do, but it was a nice sized business. And then lo and behold, out of the blue, because for understandable reasons, Wellcome Trust had not involved us in discussions. The Prodigy Living merger was suddenly presented to us, and IQ at that time was 5,000 beds. Prodigy Greystar was, I think, 18,000 beds. This was, by the way, in sort of July. To refresh your memories, I was actually on holiday when Iliya called me. So are you sitting down? This is what's going on. This is what's happening. That was in July 2015, and the merger completed in February 16. So it was a tough time, actually. I mean, in addition to working absolutely brutal hours and getting it all done, we didn't know if we had a role in the new business, being candid about it, because Greystar were the minority equity partner in the Prodigy Living vehicle, but they were also, most significantly, the appointed asset manager. So if Goldman's and Wellcome had decided that they wanted to stay with an asset management model, there weren't jobs for Stephen, Iliya, and myself. So we didn't really know what the future held. But I mean, actually, as it turned out, it held good things for us, because Greystar were let go as the asset manager, although they retained their diluted stake in the business, and we were all internalised into the newly merged IQ.
So moving forward on to when IQ was eventually sold, going up to 80 properties from, I think, or it was close to that, from the fall when you first joined. What was that period like? And I've probably got a few questions, actually, but one, asking what that period was like, and also some of the other of your exec colleagues decided to move on post that sale, but you stayed on.
Yes. So, I mean, the first thing to say is, obviously, from 2016, when it was owned jointly by Goldman's and Wellcome Trust, with Goldman's being the majority shareholder, but Wellcome Trust having equal seats on the board, to when Blackstone acquired it in 2020, so for a sort of 4-year period. I had a sort of few different roles, but I think it was always Goldman's plan to sort of bring in a big CEO with sort of public markets experience and so forth. And that's when Rob came in, and then Rob brought Matt in. So there was a certain amount of flux and change for certainly for Iliya and I. Less so for Stephen, who obviously retained his role as CFO. And then, the sale, obviously, to Blackstone in 2020, just before COVID hit. I mean, talk about timing is everything. I mean, hats off to Goldman Sachs and Wellcome Trust, who really smashed it with the timing of the sale. But post that, which, by the way, was a record in the UK for a private real estate sale at 4.7 billion. Or so I've read. No reason to disbelieve that. That was a natural time for a lot of the old exco to sort of up sticks and go, and Stephen and Iliya did in their own timing. I probably would have done the same, Gareth, but Matt and Rob reached out to me. They were very very keen that I stay on in a sort of advisory capacity. I'd already had a flirtation with going part-time that had been sort of unravelled by the Grenfell fire. So having gone part-time literally for about 3 or 4 weeks, I went full-time. So I'd always had a hankering to sort of reduce my hours. By this time, I was sort of, past the age of 55. And so they asked, so it was agreed, long story short, it was agreed with Matt that I would, with Matt and Rob, that I would go down to 2 days a week and stay on a further year in this strategic advisory role, helping out with university partnerships, doing lots of bits and pieces really around the edges, utility player, as Rob used to call me. And COVID obviously ran on a lot longer than planned. I'd already been planning my sort of world travels for after my year was up. But in agreement with the board and with Blackstone, I stayed on a further year. So 1 year became 2 years. And then finally with COVID sort of disappearing in the rearview mirror, I was able to sort of exit the business in October 22, and a couple of weeks later jump on a plane.
I suppose there wasn't much traveling to be done during the COVID period. So
there wasn't actually. I mean, I've got family in Australia, and I went to Perth in February 2020, just before COVID struck, and while negotiations with Blackstone were ongoing, and was extremely lucky to go and see my elderly mother in Perth in February, because by March, of course, we were all in a lockdown.
So moving on from, you then went traveling, and you described yourself as semi-retired. I don't know what semi-retired means.
Yeah.
What are you doing now?
Yeah, semi-retired is probably a misnomer, isn't it? You're either retired or you're not retired. Yeah, so I went away. I went away in November, traveling, and although this wasn't, contiguous, I spent 11 months traveling. Got back in October last year, and even while I was away, my phone and emails didn't stop, ringing and pinging, and so I'd always had a plan, Gareth, to go sort of plural really, and do a few different advisory sort of non-exec type gigs. So yeah, that's essentially where I'm at now. I work for QX Global as a strategic advisor for them. QX, you'll remember, provides sort of back office finance services for a lot of UK PBSA. So delighted to be working with those guys. I gave them their first break in PBSA with IQ back in 2010, actually, when we were insourcing from CRM, we needed someone to run our finance division or run the engine room stuff, accounts payable, all the grot. So QX did that. So it was nice that they tapped me up and said, come and work for us. We're doing a lot of stuff in PBSA. We think we can use your experience and advice. So I've been working with them. I've just been over to India actually to see them. I worked with one other non-exec briefly, in one other non-exec role briefly, and I've got a few other irons in the fire, shall we say. So yeah, I'm really enjoying the sort of work-life balance. And the plan is also to sort of get onto a university board or two. It's just finding the bandwidth at the moment. Again, I've been approached by a number of universities in the UK over the years to say, would you join our board? So it's just picking the right one at the right time.
I was supposed to come and see you a couple of weeks ago at an event where you were talking about the London plan 3 years on, but less said about my beach-related accident, the better. But tell me what you were going to tell me about the London plan, and
sure, yeah.
Is it being delivered?
My role with QX really is, part of my role with QX is they're this massive organisation in UK student housing that nobody's ever heard of. So one of my part of my role is really sort of raising their profile. So it's been brilliant to be able to sort of work with them in terms of producing thought leadership pieces and sort of market comment, if you like. And one of the things I worked on with QX and in this instance with CBRE was an update on the London Plan. Policy H15, which I'm sure your listeners know intimately, which is the policy that sets out the rules for development of PBSA in the capital. And the London Plan was adopted in March 21, so it was timely 3 years on, as we're now in spring 24, to look at how it's been going, what's been delivered. So so I spent a lot of the last 2-3 months putting together that report, which came out just a few days ago. In fact, I need to get on with posting that on LinkedIn actually. It's had a lot of it's generated quite a lot of press. So it's featured in Property Week, Estates Gazette, Times Higher, Bloomberg, one or two others. So it's had a good reaction. And we hosted an event at CBRE, a joint event with QX, and had about 80 people in there with a panel session. So yeah, I've loved doing that sort of, that sort of wider industry commentary, if you like. I think when you work for a large corporation like IQ, or the large corporation that IQ became, you can be, for understandable reasons, you can be quite shackled in terms of, making industry comment. And as the guy that was sort of tasked with external relations, I often found myself quite frustrated by how little I could actually, comment on the industry in terms of, my beliefs, to be honest. And actually, what's quite nice about working for QX and being, as you put it, semi-retired, is I can say what I like. I don't have to. I don't have to. I'm not really answerable to anybody. I work for QX as a consultant. I'm not on their payroll, so I'm sort of free to say what I like, really.
Well, I think I read the press release when you joined QX. You said the PBSA sector is full of potential, and I wondered what you meant by that. What you see as the potential, because going back from when you first joined the sector to where it is now, it's matured a lot. But what do you see as the potential for the sector?
Gosh, Gareth, where do you begin? PBSA is so integral to the sort of health and well-being of the UK tertiary education system. I think OECD or somebody like that has said that by 2030, 8 million students will study at university level in a country they don't reside in or weren't born in. So 8 million students globally. The UK is the second the second best provider of university education in the world. So inevitably, and we teach in English. So inevitably, lots of those 8 million people are going to want to come here. We have to provide the housing, for them. And I think government policy will come and go. It blows with the wind. We've had a lot of debate recently, haven't we, about the graduate route in terms of visas. Theresa May famously got rid of it in 2012, and applications dipped, and then it was reintroduced. And now there's debate following the MAC's report, Migration Advisory Committee report, on whether it should be reintroduced, although the report found very favourably in terms of the value that international students add to UKHE. So I think, in answer to your question, it's sort of the opportunity is there to provide, solutions that support UKHE in a big way. We all know that the universities have, limited access to capital. So the requirement for universities, or the necessity, and I think a lot of them have to be dragged kicking and screaming, but there is a necessity that they partner more than they do currently with private providers. And I think that's becoming much more the norm. I think we'll see more stock transfer activity and more organisations getting involved in refurbishment of existing university campuses. But PBSA also has a massive role to play. This is something that came through in our London Plan report. It has a massive role to play in wider housing need. 20% of BTR, built to rent accommodation in the capital, is occupied by students. 20% of BTR wasn't built for students. It just happens that students are going there because there's so little other accommodation available. HMOs, they're disappearing at a rate of knots, nationally, including in London. So PBSA has to be seen as part of the solution to the UK housing crisis, and I believe that's where its opportunity lies.
Okay. And back in, I think it was 2022, you were inducted into the Student Accommodation Awards Hall of Fame. You've never seemed to me as someone that seeks the limelight or external recognition. So if it's not for that, what drives you? Why have you been involved in the sector and had such a passion for the sector for so long? There must be a reason.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because people often ask me, with kids or people grown up now, or other people, how did you get into student housing? Depending on my mood, I can say it's a succession of wrong turns or good fortune. I don't know, Gareth. That's a really interesting question. I've never really analysed it. I was interested in, you know, the journey as I sort of set out on this podcast really was I was interested in all things global because I grew up in Africa, and that led me, to doing a geography degree with an interest in things international. It led me to the British Council, and that led me to students, and students led me to universities, and then universities I ended up being in a particular sort of commercial path within universities, which was housing, and then that led me into private PBSA. I mean, I don't. There was never a sort of, if you'd asked me if I was 21 whether I was going to be sort of, inducted into something called the PBSA Hall of Fame, I would have said, well, what's PBSA? So it's not been a life plan. It's not like becoming an accountant or a lawyer or something where you've got a reasonably clear cut sort of roadmap through life. I mean, I don't even think I'm especially a driven person. I like to do things well and to the best of my ability. I'm not a very patient man, so I like to get on and get stuff done. And I like working with talent, so particularly at IQ, and to a lesser extent, the same is true in my university days. I've worked with some tremendously gifted people. I have stood on it's a cliche, isn't it? But I've stood on the shoulders of giants, really, in terms of getting to where I've got to. And yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a waffly answer, but I'm not. I don't know. There isn't one overarching reason why I've kind of reached where I've got to, or there wasn't a single driving passion. I came from a poor coal mining town, and I was, there's none of that in the background.
Yeah, and I think I always think, obviously, I speak to lots of people in different industries, but I speak to a lot of people in student accommodation as well on the podcast, and I always think, if you weren't doing this, what would you be doing? Because like you, or to albeit for a lesser extent in terms of longevity, I fell into student accommodation because I was fed up with working in hotels, but I could have gone anywhere at that point. And that's why I always ask that sort of question is, you think you're in the sector and still in the sector, but worked in the sector for so long, it's almost, what would you be doing if you weren't in that sector? Because you must have a specific set of skills that transfer to that sector. I don't even know if that's a question, but
yeah, I don't know if there is, but there might be a question there somewhere. I mean, because I'm not professionally qualified. I mean, you come across a lot of really smart, legal minds, finance minds, surveying investment professionals, in my space, in our space, in PBSA. And so it's been a sort of weakness and a strength at the same time that I'm such a generalist, really. And as IQ got bigger, that did get more challenging, because you were going to be surrounded by professionals who were real experts in their area, which made my sort of, I guess, my university experience more and more niche as the organisation got bigger. And if I'm honest, Gareth, I sort of missed some of I missed some of working for the sort of SME-sized PBSAs, the ones that have only got 15 assets, where the names of all the managers, and the rents, and you've been around all the room types, etc. And you can really feel you can make a difference, and you're not answerable to massive wads of private equity or to shareholders. But that said, it was fun to go on the journey that went, burst through that sound barrier. But if I wasn't doing PBSA, I think I would have ended up staying in the university sector. The next obvious thing for me to do would have been to become a sort of university secretary, or chief operating officer. They all have odd titles, universities, but to become a director of the administration of the university. And that was something I toyed with for a while when I was looking to move on from LSE. I think for me, culturally, at the end of the day, and it was tough actually initially going into IQ. It was so different. It was so different to LSE. As I said, there were only 6 of us for a start. It was so different. But I think culturally, once I'd got over that sort of shock of moving from what is essentially the public sector to the private sector, it was a much better fit for me. And it was the right thing for me to do. And I did it just about early enough in my 40s, to be able to sort of make that change. But, if I was starting, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an airline pilot. Then my mother politely pointed out to me I was colorblind, so that wasn't going to happen. So it took me a year or two to get over that. But yeah, who knows? I was also quite into my amateur dramatics as a kid. I might have ended up on the stage. I don't know, all sorts of different, forks in the road and all of that.
And you've not lost the bug for travel still?
I've not lost the bug for travel still. In fact, I'm off to Corfu on Saturday, and then later on in the summer I'm doing a bit of sailing back in Greece again. Actually, we love sailing. My wife and I were both qualified yachts people, and then my daughter actually has just moved to Hanoi. I say just moved. She moved in December, so she's teaching English in Vietnam. So September I'm off to Vietnam, and then in February I'm back to Australia because my mum is 90 and she lives in Perth, so we do a bit of scooting around Australia again. So yeah, we will continue to travel a great deal, and in fact, if I can persuade my wife to retire, she's a physio in the NHS, and when we go to Australia in February, we may extend that trip and do Philippines and Indonesia and a bit of Indochina around there.
Don't know how you find all the time.
Yeah.
And will you still find the time to go and watch Arsenal?
I do. I have a season ticket. I've just renewed it. Gutted, obviously, that we didn't quite get it across the line again this year. Yeah,
they've not asked you to get involved yet, have they?
No, they've not asked. They've not asked me to get involved. Although one of my high rolling mates is potentially making an investment in a much lower division football club, and I might get involved with that. But that's a bit of a way off. Yeah, I love my sport. I've got a membership at Surrey as well, so my flat's just across the river from the Oval, so I can tune down there and watch the T20 games, and it's nice. It's a nice time of life. You'll get there sooner than you think, Gareth, and hopefully if you've stashed a few pennies, and you can sort of really enjoy yourself. Mixing up a bit of work with a bit of what you want to do, what you enjoy doing.
You probably won't like this question, but I've been reading a book recently, which it's an old book, so it's not new, but a book called Legacy by Jim Kerr. And I wonder what you think your legacy, now you're in the Hall of Fame, what do you look back? I know you've not finished, obviously, but you're semi-retired. What you see as the legacy you've left in student accommodation?
You're right. I don't know that question. I don't know. Legacies is a pretty grand term, isn't it? Really. Hopefully, I think. I don't know. I would hope that one or two people who've worked for me, and a lot have, and plenty, I'm sure, would have unkind things to say about me. But I would hope that one or two would say, actually, I learned a thing or two from David, and he was fun to work with, and he inspired these behaviours in me, or for me to go and do this, that, or the other. I think it's the impressions and the lasting friendships you make more than the bricks and mortar that are the legacies for me, hopefully.
Okay. Come on to the quick fire round questions now. So, if you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
Change one thing about the world, what would it be? Funny enough, the window I'm gazing out of at the moment, I was looking out, and Caroline Lucas, who is the outgoing Green MP for Brighton, was hammering on the doors opposite, canvassing for the upcoming general election. A lot of time for Caroline, even though I think some of the Green policy manifestos are a little bit bonkers for my taste. I think climate change is the climate change emergency, as it's often called, is a massive big deal, and I think for my children and grandchildren, it's a real worry. I mean, I have a basement flat in London, and the Mirror has written to me about the risk of flash flooding. These are present and real dangers to everybody. And I suppose, if I could change one thing, it would be that the world will embrace climate change more rapidly than this, or the dangers of climate change more rapidly than it's currently doing. It is the existential crisis, I think.
Okay. And what advice would you give to someone who wants to change direction but doesn't know where to start?
That's a tough one. Focus on the things you enjoy, and try and think deeply about what things motivate you in the workspace, and head in that direction. When I was quite young, I realized that market research wasn't for me. It wasn't, I wasn't engaging with it. It wasn't stimulating me. I needed that push from my mum to say, well, hang on, you love all things international. What about somebody like the British Council? Sometimes a wise word like that really helps. So I think, zero in on what stimulates you intellectually. We don't all have the ability to work in things we love and enjoy. But if you can reach for that, that's a good starting point. Sharon often says to me, my partner, "Oh, you love student accommodation, don't you? You never stop banging on about it when you're with your mates." And I think I'm like, nonsense. It's just a job, but actually, it has provided me with a tremendous amount of intellectual stimulation and enjoyment over the 20 plus years, whatever it is I've been doing it. So I think that is a gift. So I think for anybody who's in that situation, doing some drudge job, just think about how you can utilize the skills that you have already and direct them into something that actually will interest you.
Okay. And what's going to be your next big change?
Next big change, I don't know. I mean, in the sort of near medium term, I've just moved house in Brighton, and it is something of a project. This place I've bought. In fact, you might hear some roofers clattering around in the background of this podcast. The big change is getting this bloody place in order. It needs a new roof, a new kitchen. I know that's a bit of a crap answer. I'm 61. I don't take my health for granted. I want to do a lot more traveling, a lot more sailing, see a lot more of the world, and just make the most of the time I've got left.
And final question: if you were to recommend a guest for me to speak to on the podcast, who would it be?
A guest to speak to on the podcast? What, anybody or somebody from the?
Absolutely.
Obviously, you should clearly speak to Thierry Henry, because I'm sure he's got lots of
well, I can ask him.
Lots of great stories to tell. But who should you speak to? I'll tell you who you might want to speak to is Paddy Jackman, if you've never had him on your podcast. He has lived, I know him pretty well, he has lived a very full life. He started in the Royal Navy as a kid, and then he worked in retail in the US for years. I think it was sports shops. And then he's had roles at the University of Arts London, Imperial, big sort of commercial roles, and then he went into the private PBSA, and now he runs the regulator, Unipol, doesn't he? So he's ultimately in charge of ANAC. So I think he's had a pretty full life, actually, that guy, and has lived all around the world, seen all around the world, and done a lot of stuff in PBSA. There could be a lot worse podcasts you can do than to reach out to him.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll definitely message Paddy and see if we can get him on. David, just want to say thanks very much for joining me today. I know you didn't like the question about legacy, but I saw somebody post the other day on LinkedIn about the influence you'd had on them, and the different roles you've had across universities and across IQ and everywhere else. You can't have not influenced so many people in their careers, including my own for perhaps a brief period. But yeah, just so thanks very much.
Been great talking. Thank you.